messo, ci cambiamo? Allora, buongiorno. No, buongiorno. Forse era previsto. Servizi segreti stanno. Sì, eccoci. Temevo un intervento dei servizi segreti.
I was afraid that the intelligence was acting on our microphones. So, welcome everybody to our meeting, whose title is Need of Justice at the Root of Democracy. Unfortunately, I have to start this meeting by telling you that unfortunately, Mrs. Taheni Al-Jibeli, Vice President of the Supreme Constitutional Court of Egypt, and also President of the Meeting Cairo Association, cannot be present today. Somebody is seeking her family, and therefore she's not able to attend. And unfortunately, this is a significant absence, very important in terms of our meeting, because we are deprived of the opportunity of listening to a person who's really engaged in the current political stage in Egypt. We all know that the Constitutional Court in Egypt, and Mrs. Taheni is Vice President of the Constitutional Court in Egypt, is playing a fundamental role in the political crisis that is underway after the election of the new Egyptian president. With courage and with sense of respect for what we usually call in Europe the rule of law, which is really something to be admired in a woman and in a constitutional court in a situation like that of Egypt, where they are trying to access democracy. So on the one hand, our meeting has to accept the absence of this speaker, and also our meeting in general has not the opportunity to have the pleasure to have Taheni Al-Jibeli as a guest, for she is not simply a great juror and jurist, but she's very a good friend of our meeting. In fact, she has accepted to become president of Meeting Cairo, the sister association of Rimini Meeting, and 2 years ago they organized the meeting in Egypt. On behalf of the meeting and on behalf of all of ourselves, we give her all our solidarity, and we are very close to her. Let's now quickly introduce our two guests. Today we are going to talk with them about justice and democracy. The first one is Jason Kenney, Canada's Federal Ministry of Immigration and Multiculturalism. Jason Kenney was appointed minister in October 2008 and confirmed in May 2011. Plus, he's also president of the Committee of Management in government. He's a very beloved Canadian politician because he has been re-elected for 5 times. Last time with 77% of the votes. So a great percentage, which shows that he is really loved by the people in Canada. Our second guest is a well-known face to the Rimini meeting. Don't hide your face. He is very well known to the Rimini meeting. He's been here for many times, and we've been honored and pleased to have him here. Mr. Silvano Maria Tomasi, His Excellency, permanent observer of the Holy See at the Office of the United Nations in Geneva, and at all the international organizations headquartered in Geneva. And very few are aware of the fact that Monsignor Tomasi began his career as professor at the New York University, professor of sociology, and then he left his academic career to deeply join the life of the world. He was ambassador of the Holy See in Unshom in Africa, and then the secretary of the Pope's Council for Migrants, founder of the International Migration Review, which deals with migration, of course. And all these topics are particularly dear to Monsignor Tomasi. I met him once in Geneva, and this is just to give you an idea of the way and the weight of his responsibility. The fact that your voice speaks for the position of the Holy See in front of the United Nations, in front of international organizations such as the International Organization of Trade, WHO, the Council of Human Rights. Monsignor Tomasi is the voice of the Catholic Church in these organizations. And I noticed, talking with some friends, that he does all this on his own, basically. Just to give you an idea, the Chinese staff at WTO features around 200 delegates, diplomatic delegates, at the WTO alone. Monsignor Tomasi is much more than all of this alone. He manages to represent the whole of the Church. So, enough with introductions, but since Mrs. El Ghibelli is not present, I will use a few minutes. I hope I will not bore you. But I would like to introduce today's topic, the need for justice and democracy, with some provocative or controversial arguments. Are we certain that democracy has a future, that there is a future for democracy? Or, in other words, are we sure that the democracy we have conquered and the democracy in which we live today is the final conquest, can be taken for granted? This certainty has definitely been a solid rock conviction on which European generations that experienced the tragedy of the Second World War and totalitarianisms reconstructed all their countries. It happened to me that I visited the concentration camp in Dachau. And if you have the opportunity to experience that camp, there is an enormous piece of black marble where they've written, "Never again, never again." Democracy was seen as the only possible choice in the 1940s, 1950s, at the end of World War II, for most European countries, and not only in Europe. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights expanded democracy. And democracy is for sure seen as the best possible model. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall collapsed, and new countries that were living under authoritarian regimes got free of those regimes, they chose democracy, imperfect as it may be. While democracy is an imperfect way of ruling, it is still the best possible one, in Winston Churchill words. So democracy cannot be considered perfect in itself for a very simple reason. Because majority is not always right. And this is a fact. It's quite clear. And in order to correct this imperfection of democracy, the so-called strict constitutions have been invented. Legal and statal structures where rights, values, and aspirations of mankind, of the people, were protected by majorities. So you don't vote on rights, you don't vote on basic values, on fundamental values. Constitutions after World War II were used to correct democracy. Thanks to this important correction, democracy definitely won, certainly won, as imperfect as it may be. This is the model we all live in. Also the Church, after some uncertainties, clearly supported democracy as the model that is closer to the natural need of facing the issue of living together. Don Luigi Sturzo, the pioneer of Italian political Catholic thinking, in the early 1900s understood and stated that when Italian Catholics want to compete to rule the country, they must fight based on reasons that can be understood by everyone, showing that their proposals are concrete and valid, and not because this is dictated by priests or clergy authorities, thus conquering power in a democratic way. The same was done by communists in Italy, though rather reluctantly, because they accepted after Togliatti to join the Italian parliament, which was established through the Italian constitution, and they abandoned any idea of civil war or destructive conflict to join a democratically elected institution which represents Italy. That was Parliament. Italian Parliament, where all political forces accepted to enter, was a great school of democracy. And the same applies to Europe in those years, 1948-1950. There was established on the one hand the steel and coal community and Euratom, and that was the beginning of European community. Never before, after a very bloody war, winning countries and defeated countries would sit at the same table on equal footings. This was the first time. After every war previously, there were always armistices, and winners were stating the terms that the countries defeated had to accept. So France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, for the first time, sat on the same table with Germany, and we should well remember it, and Italy. And this is how Europe was established. Second issue, democracy and economic freedom. This appeared to be the winning combination, a sort of implicit precondition. Democratic countries and free market countries are not waging any wars between them. This was a sort of empirical evidence that was a beacon for us. A democratic country will not wage any war. A country with free trade will very hardly wage any war. This was a comfortable foundation for our countries to live peacefully for the last 50 years. But does this still hold true? The Economist, the magazine, publishes every year the so-called Democracy Index, a report on the quality of democracy in the world, a bulletin on democracy. The 2011 report is called Democracy Under Stress. According to the figures in this report, there are some concerns. According to this report, in the world, out of 200 countries, only 25 can be considered as full democracies. 53 are imperfect democracies, among them Italy. Italy is not a full democracy, according to this report. We were downgraded to second division last year. But the most impressive figure is that presently in the world, more than half of our friend men and women live in non-democratic countries. Perfect democracy is therefore still a utopia more than something that has been implemented. The widest majority of working democracies are imperfect. And the most striking figure is Europe. Europe continues to be, according to this report, the most democratic continent. But beware, the quality of democracy in Europe is dramatically diminishing. From 2008 to 2011, 15 countries out of 21 went down to second division, among them Italy, France, Greece, Portugal. But also the European countries that are still in first division cannot be too happy. Germany ranks 14th, but they have a record rate of abstentionism at elections. The United Kingdom, number 18, has the lowest level of political participation, of political engagement. So some European countries are still in the first division, in top division, but still. Well, of course, you can question those indices. They are questionable, of course, but they give you some insight. And to conclude my introduction, a second figure is the second pillar, economic freedom as a driver of democracy. Democracy and free trade and economic freedom went together for a long time. At the moment, presently, China and Russia, two of the greatest existing economic powers, are not democracies. India and Brazil are ranked in this report as hybrid regimes or autocratic regimes, so they are not fully democratic. And last, global financial flows. If you had the opportunity to listen to the presentation delivered by Professor Maduro yesterday, you could perceive this very clearly. Financial flows. The great impact exerted by changes in financial markets over the last few years happen regardless of any democratic system of accountability. So this is a great challenge. Last point. Of course, there are some positive elements, otherwise we'll become anxious. So last point, among institutions set up in our countries, parliaments, governments, and judges, a clearly democratic institution, which is the expression of democracy, parliament, is undergoing a serious crisis. Governments are definitely stronger. And politics are very much influenced by judges. That is the least democratically accountable power. Economic crisis hit the system like a tornado. And again, I refer to yesterday's lecture delivered by Professor Maduro. He shed a light on what is happening in Europe. European issue has to be included within a bigger issue, that is world global economic crisis, world global economic recession, which is hitting democracy. Economic recession, which on the one hand triggered hopes in northern African countries, starting turmoil, a wish for more well-being, and therefore the economic recession, seeing how globalization was changing everybody else's styles, triggered a demand for democracy in some countries, but it generated exactly the opposite in our countries. In Italy, we have a so-called technical government. Greece is under a sort of protection in economic and political terms. So now democracy as an ideal is under test at the moment. My impression is that we are faced with democracies which feel fulfilled, which have no any ideal drive. If you heard Miguel Maduro's presentation yesterday, well, in the end, he mentioned the difference of considering European Union simply in terms of calculation or simply in terms of love, of passion. My impression is that this analysis can be expanded, taken over. What our democracies are missing is hunger for justice, need for justice, which is the foundation of democratic demand. The wish of engagement and the desire to growth are the foundation of vital democracy. And this is what, though uncertainly, we see happening in very many countries in the world, worldwide. In the Western world, it seems today that the only way is to bring down democracy to a procedure. It looks like the last resort to save democracy. Let's remove any content in democracy. Let's remove any reference to man and dignity, but keep it simply as a decision-making procedure. My impression is the following. If this is the destination, then we're going to land in a desert beach, a beach where nobody is there. And I was surprised when I read something by Don Giussani. Well, he wrote it in 1964 on democracy, and this is to conclude my introduction, and then I will give the floor to the speakers. Don Giussani said in 1964 that democracy is a need for exact and just relationships between people and groups. The starting point of real democracy is the natural human need that living together supports the self-affirmation, and that social relationships are not an obstacle, do not hinder this growth. Democracy is not a social technique. It's not a specific mechanism of external relationships. The attempt to boil down democratic living together to pure stereotype will lead to indifference instead of respect for the others. That is, we respect each other because we are mutually indifferent. I don't care whether you're there or not, or who you are, or what you are. In this sense, multiculturalism, that is, the fact that our democracy is increasingly open to diversity, looks like the main challenge, probably the most final challenge of democracy. How can you democratically decide when we are so different? The main assumption of democracy is that we are all homogeneous. In this way, Canada is one of the most advanced examples. Everybody knows Canada as one of the experiments of laboratories where this issue of putting together democracy and difference, multiculturalism, immigration, has found and is finding the most advanced solutions, maybe. And this is the reason why I would start our dialogue by listening to Minister Kenney. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here for the first time for myself at the Rimini meeting. It's a wonderful experience of convivium, of life together, a sort of feast of ideas and fraternity. And I wish we had something like this in Canada. Perhaps I could encourage some of our Canadians here to start a meeting in Canada. And thank you very much, especially for the presence of Monsignor Tomasi, who I know from his work on behalf of the Holy See at the United Nations, where we have worked together on important issues related to refugees and migration. Now, first of all, to start with some issues, some concepts based on the theme of the session, need of justice, the root of democracy. Obviously, democracy is not just a system of majority rule. Properly conceived, democracy is a system of government predicated on the idea of the inalienable dignity of the human person, a dignity which is not a gift of the state, a dignity which precedes the state. And it is from the dignity of the human person that flows the right of human beings to govern themselves, to choose their governors. This is most beautifully expressed, I think, in one of the foundational documents of modern democracy, the preamble of the American Declaration of Independence, which says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And indeed, this is an idea that our right to govern ourselves, the democratic impulse, is in fact rooted in the Christian understanding of the human person. Jacques Maritain, at the end of following the Second World War, the great French philosopher, spoke about the evangelical impulse in creating a consciousness of human dignity which has led to democracy. He said that the democratic impulse burst forth in history as a temporal manifestation of the inspiration of the gospel. And he said that under the inspiration of the gospel, the secular consciousness has understood the dignity of the human person and has understood that the person, while being a part of the state, yet transcends the state because of the inviolable mystery of his spiritual freedom. What has been gained for the secular consciousness from the evangelical impulse is faith in the rights of the human person, as a human person, as a civic person, as a person engaged in social and economic life, and as a working person. And it is faith in justice as a necessary foundation for common life and as an essential property of the law, which is not law if it is unjust. I think that's a beautiful expression of what most of us would understand to be the roots of what is best of modern democracy. And this thinking of Maritain, I think in some ways was reflected in the teachings of John Paul II as expressed in his brilliant encyclical Centesimus Annus, where he reminded us that authentic democracy is possible only in a state ruled by law and on the basis of a correct conception of the human person. It must be observed in this regard that if there is no ultimate truth to guide and direct political activity, then ideas and convictions can easily be manipulated for reasons of power. As history demonstrates, a democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. Now, one of the men who had a huge impact on John Paul II's ideas in Centesimus Annus was the American theologian Michael Novak, who I think wrote a brilliant book that encapsulates these ideas called The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism in 1982, in which he suggested that what we call democratic capitalism is predicated on three primary systems. First of all, a democratic political system founded on the dignity of the human person. Secondly, a free market that's predicated on the dignity of work, from which flows the idea that man is entitled to a just portion of the fruits of his labors, in other words, private property. And thirdly, a pluralistic society, a society which does not seek to impose one idea through the exercise of state authority on society, but encourages the expression of authentic human freedom through local communities, through what the British politician and philosopher Edmund Burke called the little platoons of civil society. And that's where I'd like to segue to one of my political responsibilities, which is overseeing Canada's program for multiculturalism. It's been suggested that Canada's approach to multiculturalism is something of a model. Certainly in Europe, there's been a great deal of discourse about the failure of multiculturalism in Europe. Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Cameron, former President Sarkozy, many prominent, I know, Italian political leaders and social theorists have all said that multiculturalism has been a failure, and yet at the same time, I have a steady stream of European politicians coming to visit me in Canada to ask why Canada, which is maintaining the highest relative levels of immigration in the developed world, in a very diverse society, has been able to maintain social cohesion in what is a fairly successful model. It's not perfect, it's not a utopia, but it's a pretty successful model of unity and diversity. So, first of all, I think we need to clarify some terms, because one of the problems with multiculturalism is that it means radically different things to different people. I think one of the reasons that multiculturalism has been so broadly rejected as an approach to society in Western Europe is in part because it was introduced into public discourse in Europe not as a reflection of some lived social reality, not as a reflection of the concrete experience, but as an effort to impose a radical academic theory of cultural relativism that was really inspired by the Frankfurt School Marxists, who rejected the notion of the possibility of a society organized around certain cultural patrimony or traditions, and who were radical cultural relativists. And so I think Europeans have never really understood this idea as having any relevance to lived practical reality in Europe. And secondly, there's a practical problem, which relates, I think, to immigration policy. The history of immigration in Western Europe in the post-war period has in large part been based on admitting low-skilled workers from developing countries with low levels of education, typically low levels of European language proficiency, and therefore a limited ability to integrate. Practically, in Canada, our immigration policy has been based on selecting people who perhaps have a greater capacity to integrate with higher levels of so-called human capital, higher levels of education, and European language ability, which is a key to integration. But also, in Canada, the idea of multiculturalism really wasn't an imposition of some radical social theory by intellectual elites on our society. Rather, it was a reflection of the organic reality of our society and our history. It is really an inheritance from what was best about British liberal imperialism. You know, the British Empire that encompassed, was geographically and culturally the most expansive empire in human history, from India to Africa to the Americas. The British developed a brilliant capacity to accommodate difference within that system. So, for example, when the British conquered the French in New France in the 18th century, they did not seek to assimilate the French Catholics into British Protestant culture or society, but rather invited them to maintain their Catholic identity and institutions, their French language, their civil code and the legal system. And this was really a practical expression of that, I think, brilliant a British approach, a relaxed sort of laissez-faire approach towards pluralism, towards the ability of people with different, for example, different faith commitments to live together side by side in social cohesion. And that kind of approach was replicated as Canada received waves of immigration through the 20th century. Huge numbers of Eastern European and then Southern European immigrants before the Second World War, and then since the 1970s, huge number of Asian immigrants and newcomers from around the world. And so our approach to multiculturalism has been, I would say, a kind of relaxed, natural, organic approach to the reality of diversity and a recognition that the voluntary associations that people form, local communities, local faith groups, are essential to the vibrancy of our society. And so I think most Canadians do not see a contradiction between this idea of pluralism and our desire to have a cohesive society which is founded on certain core political principles. And this is a point I would make. Yes, there are academic theorists in Canada, as there are in Europe, who propagate this idea of a radical approach to multiculturalism, which, for example, would seek to suppress completely the Christian patrimony of Canada and of Europe. But they are, frankly, a tiny fringe. The reality that I experience is that most new Canadians from around the world, regardless of their faith, are actually deeply respectful of the institutions and symbols and values which are rooted in our history, which are essentially European institutions, values, and symbols. You know, every year at Christmas time, for example, there are controversies, typical controversies about whether there should be Christmas trees in public buildings or Christmas carols sung in our state schools. And it's the same debate year after year. The people who say, no, we must absolutely vacate all expressions of Christian tradition from the public square, they always make the argument in the name of multiculturalism. But what's interesting is that the people who make that argument are almost always native-born Canadian, secular white liberals, not immigrants and not members of minority faith communities, who are deeply respectful of the traditions that bind together our society. Now, there are some stresses. As we maintain the highest relative levels of immigration in the developed world, inevitably there are going to be stresses. And we all know what they are and how difficult they can be. And that's why, actually, we are currently in Canada reinforcing the notion that multiculturalism is not a license to impose any kind of even aberrant cultural practice on our society. To quote my friend here, John Zuki from CL in Canada, he says that that we take what we do is we take a balanced approach to this, not a quotes, a frantic rush to recognize minority identities in an ideological fashion. So, for example, we've published a new guide for people aspiring to become citizens, which says that Canada's diversity and tolerance do not extend to certain barbaric cultural practices, such as so-called honor killings, or female genital mutilation, or forced marriages, or spousal abuse. And we go on to make the point that, that such practices are condemned in Canada and are punished severely under our law. That's just one of many examples of how we're actually reinforcing core political values which can maintain our social cohesion in a diverse society. So, I don't see, from the Canadian perspective, any particular tension between democracy and diversity in our society. To the contrary, one of the reasons that the Canadian model has worked is that we take a balanced approach. We say to newcomers that they have a duty to integrate, but we also recognize that the host society has a responsibility to create real equality of opportunity for those who join us from around the world, in every sphere of life, including in the political sphere. And so I sit in our cabinet next to a Canadian-born young man who is a Sikh, parents are from India, who wears a turban and has a long beard and carries a kirpan, a Sikh dagger, into the House of Commons. And on the other side of me sits a woman born in Hong Kong, whose first language is Cantonese. And those two colleagues of mine are perhaps even more respectful of our historically grounded European traditions in Canadian society than many who take those things for granted. So I don't see this necessarily as a point of tension. I offer the Canadian experience as, I think, a positive one, one that is not perfect, but I think it does reflect that we have built a society predicated on the dignity of the human person, which is expressed in a free society by people being able to maintain their own identity, and that is not, I think, necessarily in tension with the idea of social cohesion.
Ringrazio di cuore il Ministro.
A heartfelt thank to Minister Kenney for this overview of the Canadian experience, which probably very many experts and political experts that study Canada, that often describe it as the model of extreme and radical multiculturalism, maybe they should be more genuine in their observations about what is going on. The idea of reasonable, balanced multiculturalism based on experience, the multiculturalism of migrants more than the multiculturalism of hosts. This is a really great opening. And now the floor is to Msgr. Tomasi. His point of view, the issue we are trying to face today, the need of justice, the root of democracy. So his viewpoint, in the heart of international organizations that try to promote this, is of particular interest to us. So we want to listen, we really want to listen to your words. Thank you. I'm very honored to be present here together with Federal Minister Kenney, with Professor Simoncini chairing this wonderful session. I will try and tackle the topic of democracy as everybody's engagement in the management of the so-called res publica, of the public good, and use the theme of this meeting, this aspiration to infinite, as a driver that pushes us to look for increasingly proactive participation by wondering, is there any effective contribution that humanistic experience and our Christian experience can provide to democracy? The quest, the search for a lifestyle that meets the deep and profound aspiration which is present in the heart of every person is disturbing to history, and it acts as yeast in it to change participation. The result is structures that in everyday life meet the needs or expectations of individuals. And this defines somehow today's democracies. United Nations, the place where I come from, and the various collective institutions that the international community has established, and which in Geneva are a real laboratory of contemporary culture in terms of human rights, labor, and so further and so on, came out from the tragedy of World War II, as Mr. Simoncini said, as an aspiration to go beyond hatred and violence in order to establish a better world. The International Court of Justice was established and came into office in 2002 as a permanent structure linked to democracy in order to avoid that winners would set up occasional tribunals. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, dozens of democracies were established. The challenge of power comes from the need of the population to see its dignity respected, to leave room to the desire for good and for beauty and justice, and to translate into operational decisions the disquietness that is present in our inner self, which leads us to good above and beyond disasters and catastrophes. And also recent political movements and turmoil in Northern Africa and in Arabic countries appear to have been triggered by the desire for labor and for the opportunity to express one's own talents and to dream an acceptable human future and to take part in its shaping, in its building. If we look at past history, we discover that aspiration to good injects dynamics in societies, even in those societies which are not fully democratic. Let's go back to the 6th century with Pope Gregorius. He wrote to some bishops that were worried about the economic situation, and he wrote to them, "Be balanced," and I quote now, "so that with freedom also justice can blossom." Interaction between freedom that establishes a variety of choices and justice that implements the common good is still a challenge. And today, as in the past, peace is the result of justice, stems out of justice. Democracy building is a particularly complex process. A global scenario is not really comforting. Institutions and the society are fragmented, and this fragmentation is present in too many countries and makes it difficult to implement the rule of law and to have just minimum cohesion which ensures peaceful and productive living together. Modern democracies are characterized by a combination of old classes. There is still a gap between countries and regions in the world, and also within individual countries between the various population classes. On the one hand, we have well-off people, educated people, technologically advanced people, and on the other hand, we have poor people who are almost technologically ignorant and without any access to technology. The implications of this contrast have a direct impact on the operation of democracy. Consistency that has to be there between the principles of equality, which are stated in the various constitutions, and the actual reality we experience every day. Economic recession added additional difficulties to the changes brought about by pluralism, established by migrations, by different lifestyles, by exaggerated individualism, and by a variety of religions and of beliefs. Even in the smallest countries, even in the smallest towns, there are some migrants with a different culture, with a different religion, and this calls for totally new situations and reality. The communication tools and entertainment programs integrates people in a world which is limited to people that are linked between themselves and who are indifferent to others. The net. We talk about the internet or the network in communication between our mobile phones or iPads. The network, which is the summation of all the links that we all have, is what we have with ourselves together with our body. Our specific network is a sort of snail with its little house when it moves. The links to whom we refer are not those of brotherhood, those that have been naturally developed from a physical link or from history, such as family, neighborhood, district, a religious community, a nation. These are flowing, flexible, liquid links. A very little effort is required to add or cancel those links. It's like adding or cancelling a number from your mobile phone directory. Unstable identities, different outlooks, closing onto oneself, the search for immediate satisfaction, all those elements can hardly support any democracy. We start without any higher aspiration. And here I would like to mention something written by the French novelist François Mauriac, when he wrote, "The cat, a cat that has eaten, he's happy, but he's not content. Joy is at a different level, is at a higher level." So new questions arise in democracies as well that need to develop reasonable criteria in order to get to a synthesis which features everybody's right in order to ensure effective representation and democratic representation. In order to achieve this target, the road is that of common good, common well-being. Justice is the fundamental criteria to protect the rights of every individual, of every citizen, faced with competing visions of the world and of the future. We need to identify some common points, some shared points that we can use to build democratic engagement or participation. These founding points of values, in order to be common, must go above and beyond the various cultures, religions, and political structures. Though they may have their roots in there, regardless from the color of your skin. And from the common tradition of a population or of a social group, what we really have in common is our human nature and the centrality of the person, who is the foundation of the universalism of rights. A connection with reality, with nature, leads to the unity of knowledge. There is not simply scientific knowledge, there is not simply logical knowledge. There are other forms of knowledge as well. The deep source, really in-depth in one person, of the creative intuition of art, poetry, is also the same source of religious experience and of rationality. A population's culture and the setting up of civilization shows a convergence of all these knowledges, and they lead to building up a criteria for living together, whose most universal and most comprehensive language is that of human rights, that support freedom of belief and freedom of expression, equal dignity of every person, the need for dialogue as a way to reconcile differences. Human rights are deeply rooted in the heart of a person, and their language benefits from the various aspects, the various phases of knowledge. And therefore, we cannot impose whims or passions on them as rights, whereas we should foster a right balance which would cater for democracy's operation by taking realistically into account the current pluralism which is present in our societies. The task of decision makers that want to respect democracy is to establish preconditions that would foster full engagement of people, families, social groups, power to the service of common good. decision makers and lawmakers translates justice into everyday life, so that through the application of subsidiarity, everyone has got what they need, and the poorest classes really participate, take part in equal opportunities. Unfortunately, very often we see in our experience that there is a contradiction between those aspirations and reality. Another issue is reluctance to talk about religious discrimination, as if the application of human rights to the faithful has not the same value, and for the state and for the international community is not the same duty as in front of any other person, as it is in front of any other person. Regarding fundamental issues of law, where the human dignity is at stake, the majority principle is no longer sufficient. Every person holding or being accountable has to search for the criteria of his or her choices in his or herself. This was said by Pope Benedict XVI in front of the Bundestag of the German Parliament September last year. Regardless of specific religions, a unity of knowledge leads us to recognize or to acknowledge what is right. Nature and reason meet in order to cater or to provide the democratic process with those principles and those moral founding values that go above and beyond social consensus. In democracies, we meet people with very different visions, sometimes even contrasting visions. What rules should guide the faithful when they are engaged in the democratic debate? Religion becomes a test for democracy. Law, or the right of the faithful to utter their opinion on issues with ethical implications, the right to express themselves freely and to organize themselves and to express institutions that reflect and apply religious belief, are elements that just democracy has to acknowledge. And here we go back to the issue whether in a democratic context also religions has to adjust and to adapt to rules that are derived from the will of majority. This is one of the issues that in current democracies, especially in the Western world, is very hotly debated. In certain countries, the actual lack of freedom causes persecution, the lack of protection that citizens experience in other countries is a more subtle way of discrimination. Aspiration to equality of rights for everyone leads in fact to discrimination of those with different opinions because of their religious belief. In contemporary democracies, well, these current democracies need to confront themselves with the new emerging situation of pluralism in our societies. Without losing any of their qualities, these democracies will have to accept contributions provided by others. Contemporary fragmentation of society can be an obstacle, but at the same time an opportunity to establish innovative forms of solidarity. Let's go back to history now. French Revolution talked about liberty, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. For sure, a lot of progress has been made since. The flag of revolution, freedom, equality, and brotherhood, which without doubt has some Christian roots, well, this flag is applied in various ways. Let's see how. Freedom, yes, for certain. The person, the individual, is at the center of everything. Equality, yes. a sense of equality is part of government structures, of state structure, at least as an ideal objective, an ideal target to reach. And brotherhood? We have remained shy in affirming brotherhood. Still, with brotherhood in contemporary democracies, differences can turn into opportunity, into building stones for a richer and more interesting future. The relationship between freedom, equality, and brotherhood goes above and beyond any cultural expression or any specific historical moment. Actual freedom is connected to truth and to the limitations imposed by it for the implementation of justice. Equality goes above and beyond the uniform roles that are carried over in society, and brotherhood gives democracies the opportunity to work in current pluralism. And now I get to the conclusion. There is an original input that Christianity can provide for the reconstruction of democratic societies that would counterbalance, offset centrifugal forces by establishing a common space where common projects such as solidarity, trust in the future, are implemented together or carried out together. We need to rediscover the type of brotherhood that is present 19 times in the New Testament through the a Greek word which is koinonia, which means communion. Maybe we will not get to have a religious understanding of this world, but its message is very practical. Communion is profound engagement, participation, sharing together a set of elements that establish a link with other people through common experiences and objectives in order to achieve a far bigger objective. The image of this idea, which is an ideal together as well as an idea, is depicted in the wonderful fresco by Giotto in the Scrovegni Chapel, where he shows the communion of the saints. A realistic fresco where also evil, with its rationality, is visible in the depiction of hell. Brotherhood is not simply functional to economic and material objectives, but it can also be revolutionary, a breakthrough in its originality, since it effectively attributes a real value to every single person, regardless of their state, and simply because they are part of this brotherhood. From this viewpoint, economic freedom and technology of communication technology can open to others and help society blossom. Young people, together with other builders of the city of men, in rediscovering brotherhood, find an opportunity to reconstruct a new democracy, where justice prevails and where every person is equal, while performing different services for the common good. Unless we implement this fraternity, we make this brotherhood come true, globalization underway will become ambiguous, problematic, and unjust. Our common future, instead of being turned into convenient relativism, can become a successful experience, because so that freedom, equality, and fraternity can lead the way to the authentic inspiration, to the aspiration to the infinite, which is the most precious sign of our humanity, of our mankind. This aspiration must continue to stimulate us, to take us, to drive us towards everybody's engagement in our local, national, and global communities. Then, the need of justice for true democracy will be enacted, will be implemented, and will open a much wider horizon than that of justice, which is the horizon of love. Thank you very much.
approfittando del fatto che
taking advantage of the fact that we still have some time, I'd like to ask both of you another question. And please give me a short answer. If you, well, from the two presentations, my introduction seems to have changed. Well, my introduction was rather gloomy. Instead, the two testimonies were positive and more rosy. You have shown that democracy can have a future, and this is good news from the meeting Rimini to the rest of the world. My question to you is, starting from the last observation by Monsignor Tomasi, were you to say which are the values, the contents, the bases on which this democracy that is not the old model but something new which is taking place, this democracy which is not afraid of multicultural dialogue, this democracy which is not afraid of economic crisis and which is capable of talking about fraternity again? Well, where would you start from again? What do you think is the value to start from again, or the values? Which indications would you recommend? Because, you know, the meeting is not like the meeting of Davos, for example, where you analyze the world. The meeting in Rimini is a place where questionable answers are given. So what is your hypothesis in this respect, Minister Kenney?
Well, I'll be gloomy if you'd like. I think that perhaps one of the reasons we were assigned this topic of democracy and justice on a panel with someone who's a member of the Judicial Council of Egypt is perhaps to reflect on the problem of democracy in the context of the Arab Spring. So let's look beyond Europe and North America to a situation that's unfolding where, of course, filled with a sense of hope, the emergence of a democratic spirit in parts of the world, particularly the Middle East, that have lived under authoritarian regimes for essentially their entire history. But at the same time, the deep concern that these new democratic systems may not be founded on a sense of justice and certainly not on a sense of pluralism. And this is the concern I think I'd like to highlight, which is that, you know, I know Europeans are anxious about this issue of multiculturalism, of diversity, but let's realize what a great gift it is. What a great gift it is to be able to accept within a cohesive society different faith commitments, the exclusive truth claims that are made by those different faith communities, to accept freedom of expression and freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, which is really ultimately what we're talking about in terms of pluralism. But now we have political movements in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere. I mean, look, the Islamic Republic in Iran was a democratic uprising against an authoritarian regime, which has sought to completely eradicate any expression of pluralism in that society, which was actually grounded on an ancient and very sophisticated civilization in Iran, to the point where members of minority faith communities like the Baha'i, or Muslim converts to Christianity, or gays and lesbians, or political dissidents are hounded, imprisoned, tortured, and executed. And we all hope that that distorted approach to democracy is not revisited, for example, in Egypt, with a large minority faith community, the Coptic community, some 9 million people who are about to elect their new pope and who have an ancient place in that society and participate at all levels in that society, and yet are terrified that if democracy takes the wrong direction in Egypt, that they will live under increasing pressure, unable to properly express freedom, their freedom of conscience and religion. And even worse, we look at the situation in Syria today, where every day now, thousands of refugees, disproportionately Christians and religious minorities are fleeing Syria into neighboring countries because they are terrified. As bad as the Ba'athist regime has been in in Syria, they're terrified with the prospect of a new regime inspired by Salafist intolerance towards religious minorities. So I think to bring this in a concrete level, I think for move beyond the sort of abstractions that we deal with in modern Western liberal societies, to look at this problem in this tension between the democratic impulse and the need for justice and the need to respect, the need to protect freedom of religion and conscience and expression, which is at its core what pluralism is all about. So I think that's something that we shouldn't lose mind of.
If we look at the very many conflicts which are currently underway, the ones that we are aware of, and even those who are in the back pages of newspapers, which, however, cause victims every day, we see that at the root of these conflicts there is the inability to be engaged in social life on equal footings, which means there is a failure of democracy, either because of tribal reasons, for ethnic reasons, for religious reasons, because of the lack of technical preparation, and so further and so on. While true democracy essentially means giving the opportunity to individuals, groups, families, social groups to be engaged through mechanisms and tools that every community devises to be engaged in the management of public life. Well, if this is democracy, we see that there are very many failures. However, we do not need to be gloomy or pessimistic. We would be pessimists if we had no way of finding any solutions. Instead, there is a way, there is a road to find solutions. The issue is the political will to go down that road. First, we need not leave room just to the usual cultural and economic elites that manipulate the democratic structures, thus perpetuating their power to their benefit, rather than to the benefit of community at large and of society at large. This is one of the dangers that was present in all democracies and that continues to come out. Second, there is a new development in today's world. Sometimes by appealing to expertise, to technical competence, technical ability, the risk is that the majority would no longer be engaged. There are new developments that need to be tackled. However, at the root, there always remains a new strength, a new force, a new driver, which is eternally new and eternally positive. We can call it brotherhood. We can call it respect for the inner dignity of every person. We can call it the equality of any human being in front of community and in front of the law. But it is only if we respect this fundamental principle, which is central, which is serving people and not people serving the state, or people serving other institutions. This must prevail. If we go down this road, which after all is the road of the New Testament, and after all, we may not want to use religious terms, but this is the experience that actually led to democracies, because it acknowledges the dignity of every person. Today, this road, is this intuition still dynamic and alive? Yes, it is. And can it still relive and revive our societies? This is a question to which we should all answer. My answer is yes. My answer is yes. It is still there. We still have this opportunity. I would really like to thank our speakers, because I must say that in a very surprising way, at least for me, today we listened to a dialogue on a very thorny and complex issue with the minister. We were talking about how can we find a line within the framework of our title. It was rather difficult. However, what impressed me the most is the way we managed to actually define proposals and indications that are feasible. Maybe because there is a Canadian politician and a religious person. With Italian politicians, you would very hardly obtain any clear indications on the future. With Italian politicians and with local politicians. However, I must admit that I was really surprised by the clarity of their presentations. There is some hope. Our world, in very many moments, faces forks. Those countries, the countries mentioned by Minister Kenney, are in front of two roads, and nothing will guarantee us that they will choose the road of democracy based on justice. We are always facing two roads, and the need for justice, democracy without justice, remains a formal model with all sorts of consequences. But the real issue is what keeps awake in every person this idea that the need for justice is not only the outcome of chemical stimulations, or that this need for justice is not simply a peculiar attitude developed by mankind, and which simply differentiates it from other races at different levels of biochemical evolution. This is the theme of the meeting suggested by Javier Prades when he said that among the cultural implications of this title, that by nature man is relation to the infinite, is this vision that man is absolute dignity. As Mr. Tomasi said, this point can be shared by everyone. This can be the foundation and can be shared by everyone. The need to put any type of structure of power in relationship with the dignity of man. Christianity adds something to this. That is the explanation, the reason why. Why is man provided with infinite dignity? And when we go back to the introductory words uttered by the Pope, saying that by nature man is relation to the infinite, means saying that then every person was created in order to enter a dialogue with God and with infinite. In the onset of world's history, Adam and Eve are the outcome of God's love action, made in his image and in his likeness, and their life and relationship with the Creator were the same. This is the reason that Christianity provides to explain why dignity is absolute. There may be others. There may be other explanations. This is what is suggested by Christianity in history and in its experience. Well, and after all, we have a road in front of us. This is the good news, and we end today's meeting on this positive note. I would like to thank again Minister Kenney and His Excellency, Mr. Tomasi. And now I invite you to continue with the meeting. Thank you very much.